Growing up, I thought everybody had a second family in their storm cellar. By and large, I figure out how crazy that sounds. Yet it was all I'd at any point known. I realized that consistently. My father raised the extras from supper with foil, got up without a word, and conveyed the plate to the cellar. I'd tune in from my room as he stumbled down the squeaking advances, paused my breathing to hear the stifled mumblings of his hello. I realized that each day he'd make the excursion down the stairs to see his subsequent family off before work, then kiss me on the highest point of my head and unsettle my hair as he left. I realized that every Christmas he'd bring a sack of splendidly wrapped bundles down the stairs in a St. Nick suit. I realized that my father had a second family in the storm cellar, and it appeared to be typical to such an extent that I thought every other person did as well. I will always remember whenever I first got some information about them. I was youthful, perhaps 5, when I at long last tracked down the words to inquire, "Mama, for what reason might I at any point play with individuals in the cellar?" My mother was the human exemplification of excited energy, a natural, unending movement machine, continuously pacing or cleaning or blending a pot continuously with a lit cigarette tucked between her yellowing fingers. I will always remember that, as that question lingered palpably, she at last halted interestingly. Her quietness was disrupting in a manner I can't exactly make sense of. "We don't discuss them," she surged, pursuing the rushed explanation with an extended drag off her cigarette. She blew a tuft of smoke out the opened window prior to inclining down to meet me at face level, her red eyes simply crawling from my own. "You don't have to play with the children. However, the children need Daddy." Once more, she stopped, the unpleasant picture of her at a halt, drawing itself into my brain for all time. "At last," she murmured, "Daddy needs them as well." That evening, I heard my mother yelling at my father in their room. I was amazed that they didn't realize that I knew, more stunned, terrified, even to find that they didn't believe I should be aware. In particular, they didn't maintain that I should tell anybody at school, anybody by any means. Truly, after that evening, everything was unique. My father just raised the extras after supper, just brought the food down the stairs after I'd hit the sack. He quit visiting them in the mornings through and through. My mother began acting in an unexpected way. As well, I'd constantly seen that she was far off from my father, had consistently seen how she seethed under his touch, how she took away to the opposite side of the room at whatever point he entered. However, it deteriorated after that. As a youngster, I felt profoundly regretful. I felt like I'd demolished my folks' marriage. However, I was only a youngster, and I was interested. My mother intended to prevent me from posting more inquiries, yet she incidentally offered something that made me considerably more inquisitive. The first floor family had children, perhaps kids my own age to play with. I had to be familiar with them, in the way that young children need to see all of the oddness of this tumultuous world, need to get a handle on the babble that encompasses us day to day. The hogwash that we become accustomed to as grown-ups, however, battle interminably as kids, similar to a riddle or a conundrum or a word issue on a number-related test about purchasing 80 watermelons. Another change. Following that basic evening, the cellar entryway was fitted with a strong lock. Indeed, even still, I had to be aware. There's something terribly ghastly about figuring out that a second storm cellar family is strange, something more horrendous still, about not knowing who or why. When I was 7, I decided to make quick work of it, to try not to cause problems. I could research when 3 circumstances were met. I was home from school, my father was currently working, and my mother wasn't around to get me. These conditions seldom covered, yet whenever I first returned home from school to observe that my father's vehicle wasn't in the carport and my mother's unending development had driven her to the place of fatigue, I lost my shoes and crawled to the cellar entryway, calm in my sock feet, and afterward, I knocked. It was a calm knock, inspired by a paranoid fear of waking my mother from her rest. However, it was a thump. In any case, it was something other than a thump as well. It was a commencement, a greeting, a showdown of my life's most noteworthy and generally unnerving secret. I hopped when a delicate thump got back from the opposite side. It was practically prompt, like the individual on the opposite side had been hanging tight for me. The idea froze me up briefly. However, I realized I didn't have the opportunity and willpower to squander it. My mouth felt out of nowhere of sandpaper and chalk, yet I inclined toward the way to murmur, "Greetings. Hi." It was a little girl, her voice sweet yet timid, like testing the keys on a piano for the first time. I'm Ricky. What's your name?" A long pause. "Leela. My brother is Isaac, but he doesn't talk so well, but he's still little. Mommy says he'll start talking when he's ready. There's 3 of you down there?" "Mm-hmm," she replied simply, as if the entire situation felt as wholly normal for her as it had for me. On the opposite side of the basement door, Daddy comes to visit sometimes, though, so I guess there's 4. My eyes widened as a flurry of questions began to sprout in my mind, but I heard my mom start to stir in her room. I sped down the hallway and into the playroom. I bruised my hands with my toys, but my mind was somewhere else. The sprouts of questions continued to grow rapidly, soon overtaking my thoughts like an unruly patch of weeds. And like weeds, the questions were stubborn, impossible to get rid of. The roots of the situation and its implication unraveled, stretched through my whole body. Fear planted itself firmly in my belly as I was forced to confront the possibility that I didn't really know my dad, didn't really know my own family at all. If my dad was Lila's dad, too, what did that mean for me, for my family, and why wasn't she allowed to come out of the basement? Over the next couple years, I stole away to the basement door in those rare moments of freedom. I got to know Lila, got to like her, and eventually even to love her. She was my best friend. As a kid, I was pretty lonely. My classmates shied away from me for reasons I couldn't quite understand. Like something about me was inherently repellent to my peers. I only had one friend at school, and at home, I had Leela. As we spoke more, a never-ending stream of back and forth questioning crammed into the briefest moments of time. We both came to understand the differences between us, between our lives and our circumstances. The differences that at first felt so normal grew bigger and sharper and scarier than either of us could comprehend. The unfairness of it all became impossible to ignore. Lila lamented that she wasn't allowed to go to school, that she couldn't go outside to play or make friends or ride bikes around the cul-de-sac in the summer until the street lamps flickered on and the cicadas started to scream. She even longed for the things I loathed most. Homework, rinsing off my dishes after dinner, tidying up my room each Sunday morning. She said she'd lived in that basement all of her life and was probably even born down there. She couldn't remember anything different before being locked up in the cold and musty room. I'm ashamed to admit this, but eventually, I couldn't manage the guilt I felt for living the life Lila never had, could never have in my mind. I was so young, so naive. I didn't know how to manage the situation anymore, so I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped trying. I stopped visiting Lila. No more secret, whispered exchanges. No more quick knocks on the door, just to let her know that I was there, that anyone at all was there for her. Days and weeks and months and years trickled by, with Lila never quite leaving my thoughts, but with her existence instead, compartmentalized, confined to the basement of my own mind. At home, it was harder to keep thoughts of her locked away. When my dad bought her dinner, hours past my bedtime, I'd lay awake warm in my bed. Sometimes I'd hear her scream. Sometimes I'd hear the tray clatter to the floor, the plate fracturing on impact. Sometimes I'd hear her crying, awful, painful sobs, while I assembled new Lego sets in the playroom. Sometimes she would call out my name. I'll never forgive myself for this. I hate myself for it, and I deserve to. But I ignored her every time. Worst of all, though, was when she started knocking. I was finishing up my science homework for the day when the first knock came. A quiet knock, but a knock nonetheless. An initiation, an invitation, a confrontation. My blood ran cold as I realized where it was coming from, who it was coming from. I hopped on my bike and didn't come home until dinner was on the table. That night, I heard my dad scream back at Leela for the first time, yelled for her to knock it off with all the knocking. He took care of her little brother and her mom, and that he could only do that if she stayed in the basement, if she stayed quiet. She wasn't persuaded, though, and her knocking only grew more frequent and louder. I was about 10 years old by then, so I had a little more freedom. All the freedom in the world. Compared to Lila, I avoided my house at all costs, only returning in the evenings, where I'd be greeted immediately by the knocking. By then, it was less knocking and more ramming the total weight of her body into the door. My mother took to vacuuming the house obsessively, just to cover up the noise. She wouldn't even look my dad in the eye anymore. I imagined the bruises blooming on Lila's shoulder, up and down the length of her arm. If it hurt her, she didn't let on. She didn't stop. Sleep became a distant memory, leaving me dazed and irritable and confused, and most of all, terrified. I began showing up at my school friends, now my only friends, house unannounced, just to escape Lila's knocking. His parents clearly didn't like me, and tensions rose between the two of us kids, escalating to a boiling point that ended in a fight. I slugged him in the gut, and he returned with the words that broke me, broke everything, a blow far more powerful than he could have delivered with small hands balled up into fists. My mom says you're a bastard, that your mom's a whore. I had to look up the words in my dictionary when I got home. I had to gather the courage to, once again, ask a difficult question. Mom, am I a bastard? I had to watch my mom lose her momentum, to stop again. I had to watch what little light she had left in her go out. I had to sit there as she left the room, had to sit there spilling hot tears as the knocking kicked up again, each powerful thrust against the door, racking my mind. A painful reminder that Lila was coming for me. But my mom came back, and she returned with an old newspaper clipping in her hands, worn at the edges. She held it to her chest as she finally told me the truth about Lila, about Dad's second family in the basement. I was young, but I needed to know. My mom knew it, too. Through choking sobs, she told me about my dad's old family, the one he'd had and made before he met her, the horrible mistake they'd made, the one that gave her the best thing she'd ever had in her life, but took away 3 others, about how my dad's old wife was already skating on thin ice, her cries for help that went unanswered. How, when she found out about what my mom and my dad were doing, that what little was left beneath her shattered, about how they couldn't have known but about the guilt she carried regardless. Like a heavy backpack. Mom? Yes, sweetie, but I can never put it down that Lila was dead, and Isaac, too, that their mom had done that to them, and then did it to herself too. My dad found them in the basement when he got home from work, that he'd never forgiven himself, and my mom never had either, that when they reappeared back in the basement, like nothing had occurred, even after their bodies were taken and covered such a long time back, they couldn't consider anything to do, however, to give them typical daily existence as could really be expected. One more troublesome inquiry. Yet, for what reason do they need to remain in the cellar? I figured it out sometime thereafter when my father returned home from work and opened the entryway. Lila emerged from the shadows, and I jumped naturally as I saw her face. Interestingly, saw the vast opening right in front of her, where her left eye ought to have been. Isaac was minimal, like Lila said. However, the overflowing injury to his jaw would have made it almost unimaginable for him to talk, assuming he got the opportunity to grow up. I was frightened from the beginning. However, I put on my good show and took Lila by the hand. I played with Lila and Isaac, interestingly, shared my toys with them, chuckled with them. I didn't meet their mother that day, yet I would, years after the fact, when she and Lila and Isaac realized what happened to them. She battled to adapt. She doesn't come out frequently, yet I treat her with thoughtfulness when she does. The lady I realize now couldn't envision doing what she did. My father's subsequent family actually remained inside. However, they were not generally restricted to the shadows of the cellar after that day. They turned out to be less of my father's second family, as we as a whole became one bigger family that chuckled and played and cherished together. I don't reside in that house any longer. I'm a grown-up now, with a huge appreciation for the entirety of the opportunity and open doors accessible to me that I once underestimated. I realize my family is nowhere near typical, even terrible and shocking in numerous ways that I assisted with propagating as a youngster. Yet it's all I've at any point known. I love them, every one of them. I actually visit at whatever point I can for birthday celebrations and for Christmas and for summer getaways. What's more, at whatever point I do visit, I pause for a minute to be thankful for the way that when I thump on the front entryway, Lila opens it